In the last 72 hours, the global economic order has shifted in a way that no trade model predicted and no diplomatic backchannel could contain. Mark Carney, the former central banker turned prime minister, has done what no allied leader has done in nearly a century. He looked at the most aggressive trade ultimatum ever issued by an American president, reviewed the terms, reviewed the deadline, reviewed the full economic weight of the largest market on earth backing those demands, and said no, not a counteroffer, not a request for more time, not the kind of diplomatic hedge where a country publicly rejects terms while quietly negotiating compliance through backchannels. A total, complete, and permanent rejection delivered with a single word that every trade lawyer, every diplomatic historian, and every economist immediately understood as irreversible. Donald Trump gave Canada 30 days. He demanded the rollback of all retaliatory tariffs without reciprocal action from Washington. He demanded American regulatory oversight over Canada's critical mineral exports, effectively giving the United States veto power over where Canadian lithium, cobalt, and rare earths could be sold. He demanded minimum purchasing thresholds for American manufactured goods, turning Canadian procurement into directed trade. And he demanded a dispute resolution mechanism where the United States would serve as both defendant and judge. The implicit threat was total: full-spectrum tariffs on every Canadian good, financial sector restrictions that would choke cross-border capital flows, and the possible invocation of emergency economic powers. 3 allied governments privately told Ottawa to comply. Canada's own finance ministry ran 14 scenarios. In 11 of them, rejection led to a recession within 2 quarters. In 9 of them, the Canadian dollar dropped between 8 and 14%. Every number, every simulation, every historical precedent pointed to the same conclusion. Compliance was the rational choice. Then Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa with the Canadian flag behind him and no teleprompter in sight, and he spoke for 12 minutes. The first 11 minutes were a clinical, data-driven summary of Canada's economic diversification progress. New trade agreements, new infrastructure investments, new supply chain partnerships. He presented it all without defiance, without urgency, as completed work, as decisions already made and execution already underway. Then in the final 60 seconds, he paused, looked directly into the camera, and said the words that changed the trajectory of the global trading system. Canada does not accept ultimatums. Our economic diversification is not a negotiating tactic. It is not a temporary measure. It is not leverage. It is a permanent and irrevocable restructuring of Canada's economic relationships, and it is already underway. Permanent and irrevocable. Those were the words that broke the mechanism. The one that every trade lawyer immediately focused on was irrevocable. That is not a political word. It appears in contract law and treaty language, in the binding instruments of international agreements. It means the decision cannot be reversed, will not be reversed, cannot. Carney, a man who spent his career at 2 of the world's most powerful central banks, chose it with surgical precision. He was not making a political promise that a future government could walk back. He was signaling that the structural changes, the trade agreements, the infrastructure investments, the supply chain redirections had been designed from the beginning to be permanent, built with contractual commitments, implementation timelines, and institutional frameworks that would survive changes in government, changes in political conditions, and changes in the bilateral relationship. The rejection landed in Washington at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. The White House press office received 46 media inquiries in the first 15 minutes. No statement was issued. No background briefing was offered. The press secretary's office released a single line at 4:30 p.m., stating that the administration was reviewing the Canadian Prime Minister's remarks. They are still reviewing them. What the president expected to happen after the deadline passed was specific, predictable, and based on 80 years of precedent. He expected the markets to punish Canada. He expected the Canadian dollar to drop. He expected Canadian business leaders to publicly pressure Carney to reverse course. He expected international opinion to remain neutral because neutrality is what nations default to when a smaller economy challenges a larger one. None of that happened. What happened in the first 24 hours was that the Canadian dollar did not drop. It held, not because of central bank intervention, not because of emergency monetary policy. It held because the market looked at the rejection and made a calculation that the White House had not anticipated. The market calculated that a country with a clear long-term strategy, a country actively reducing its dependence on an unpredictable trading partner, a country whose leadership was making decisions based on structural economic analysis rather than political fear, was a safer bet than a country issuing ultimatums it could not afford to enforce. 2 international credit rating agencies issued statements within hours affirming Canada's sovereign credit rating with stable outlooks. The language in both statements was notable. One cited policy clarity and strategic consistency as supporting factors. The other referenced credible long-term economic diversification, reducing single market dependency risk. Both phrases meant the same thing. The rating agencies looked at Carney's rejection and saw not risk but stability. A country with a clear strategy, a country reducing its exposure to an unpredictable trading partner, was from a credit perspective becoming safer by walking away. In the first 48 hours, the international response began, and it moved in the opposite direction from what the White House had modeled. The European Union was first. A formal statement from the EU's chief trade officials supporting the sovereign right of every nation to determine its own trade relationships free from coercive external pressure. The language was careful. It did not name the United States. It did not need to. Japan moved next. Within 6 hours of the EU statement, Japan's trade ministry announced the acceleration of 2 bilateral trade agreements with Canada that had been in negotiation for over a year. South Korea followed, then Australia, then the United Kingdom, which issued a statement that was notably warmer toward Canada than anything London had said publicly during the entire confrontation. The British statement referenced rules-based trade among sovereign partners, a phrase that diplomatic analysts immediately identified as a pointed contrast to the ultimatum's framework of unilateral American authority. Within 48 hours, 7 nations had publicly positioned themselves in support of Canada's rejection, not through coordinated action, not through a formal alliance, but through the much more powerful mechanism of independent alignment. Each nation acting in its own interest, reaching the same conclusion. But it was what happened in the next 24 hours that fundamentally changed the equation. 4 nations that had been privately negotiating compliance with their own American trade demands paused those negotiations. This was the cascade that no one in Washington had modeled. Because Washington had modeled Canada in isolation. They had modeled the bilateral relationship, the tariff impacts, the currency effects, the GDP projections. What they had not modeled was the demonstration effect, the second-order consequence of a public refusal succeeding. Because the ultimatum was not just about Canada, it was about precedent. Every nation facing American trade pressure was watching to see what happened when a mid-sized economy refused, watching to see whether the cost of defiance was really as high as the United States needed everyone to believe. Canada refused. The cost was lower than expected. The international support was larger than expected. The market punishment did not materialize. And 4 governments in 4 different regions independently reached the same conclusion. If Canada can refuse and survive, the calculus has changed. The cost of defiance has been repriced. Not slightly, fundamentally. And the premium they had been paying for compliance, the concessions they had been making, the sovereignty they had been quietly surrendering may no longer be justified. The president did not just help Canada. He helped everyone who was watching. And everyone was watching. Those 4 paused negotiations represent over $200 billion in combined trade volume with the United States. Not lost, not canceled, paused, which in diplomatic terms is worse than canceled. Canceled means the relationship has ended. Paused means the relationship is being reevaluated. It means the terms that were previously acceptable are no longer automatically acceptable. It means the leverage that was previously taken for granted is no longer taken for granted. Here is where this stops being about Canada and the United States and starts being about something structural, something that extends beyond this confrontation, beyond these 2 leaders, beyond even the 80-year framework that the rejection just fractured. The shift is permanent. Not because anyone decided it should be permanent, but because the architecture of permanence was built into the rejection from the beginning. 3 forces make it irreversible. The first is the credibility ratchet. Ultimatums are a depreciating asset. Every ultimatum that works makes the next one more credible. Every ultimatum that fails makes the next one less credible. The president's ultimatum to Canada was supposed to demonstrate that American economic leverage is absolute. Its failure demonstrated the opposite. The next time the United States issues a trade ultimatum to any nation, the response will include a reference to Canada. They refused. They survived. The coalition held. The markets did not punish them. Why should we comply? That question is now permanently embedded in the calculus of every trade negotiation the United States enters. The second force is the coalition effect. Before the rejection, nations facing American trade pressure were isolated. Each one negotiated alone, calculated alone, complied alone. The isolation was the leverage. A single nation standing against the United States faces overwhelming odds. The economic asymmetry is too large. The political risk is too high. The potential for retaliation is too severe. No rational actor takes that bet alone. But a coalition of nations standing together changes the math entirely. The risk is distributed. The retaliation is diluted. The political cover is mutual. The rejection created something that did not exist before. A visible, public, documented coalition of nations willing to endorse economic defiance of the United States. Not as an aggressive act, but as a sovereign right. Coalitions once formed do not dissolve when the event that created them ends. They persist because every member's participation reduces the cost for every other member. The more nations that stand together, the less any single nation risks by standing. The coalition becomes self-reinforcing. It grows not through recruitment, but through rational self-interest. And it cannot be broken by pressuring any single member because the coalition's existence is what protects each member from pressure. The third force is infrastructure lock-in. This is the one that makes the shift truly irreversible, regardless of politics, regardless of elections, regardless of who occupies the White House next year or 10 years from now. The trade agreements Canada signed are not political statements. They are contracts with implementation timelines, investment commitments, financial penalties for early withdrawal, and institutional governance structures that operate independently of any single government's preferences. The shipping infrastructure being built, the Arctic corridors, the Pacific port expansions, the LNG terminal redirections. These are physical assets, concrete and steel and fiber optic cable. You do not dismantle a pipeline because the president who provoked its construction leaves office. You do not terminate a trade agreement because the political confrontation that motivated it has cooled. You do not reroute a supply chain that took 2 years and $4 billion to build because someone makes a phone call. Infrastructure outlasts politics always has. The trade routes established during the British Empire's decline did not reverse when British foreign policy changed. The manufacturing supply chains that moved to Asia in the 1990s did not return when American trade policy shifted. Physical and contractual infrastructure creates switching costs so high that the new arrangement becomes the permanent arrangement by default. Canada's diversification was designed this way from the start, not as a temporary pressure tactic, but as an infrastructure project. And infrastructure projects once built defined the landscape for decades. The shift is not coming. The shift has already happened. The rejection was the announcement, but the restructuring was already underway. Now the domestic political fallout has moved in directions the White House did not model. The problem is not partisan. The problem is structural. The ultimatum's failure raised a question that transcends party affiliation and political ideology. If American trade leverage depends on the credibility of threats, and the threats have just been publicly discredited, what replaces them? 4 Republican senators issued statements within 72 hours. None mentioned the president by name. All stated the same principle in different words. American economic leadership cannot depend on coercion. It must depend on competitiveness. If our trading partners are choosing to diversify away from American markets, the answer is not to threaten them for leaving. The answer is to build markets worth staying in. 3 former trade representatives published a joint analysis, arguing that the ultimatum model had been degrading for years, that Canada's rejection was not the cause of the shift, but the proof of it, that the assumption of automatic compliance had been eroding through every trade confrontation of the last decade, and that the ultimatum to Canada was the moment the erosion became visible, the moment the crack in the foundation reached the surface. One of those former trade representatives said something in a television interview that cut through the political noise with unusual clarity. "We have been operating on the assumption that our market size alone is sufficient leverage. That assumption required every trading partner to believe they had no alternatives. Canada just showed them the alternatives. And the alternatives are real. They have contracts, they have timelines, they have infrastructure budgets. You cannot compete with concrete by issuing threats." American business leaders confronted the implications immediately. CEOs of companies with global supply chains began recalculating their exposure, not to Canada specifically, but to the assumption of American trade dominance generally. The Business Roundtable issued a statement that called for a fundamental reassessment of America's competitive positioning in global markets based on value creation rather than leverage application. The international dimension is the most consequential and the most irreversible. European trade officials told Reuters that Carney's rejection had accelerated internal discussions about European supply chain diversification that had been considered too politically sensitive to pursue openly. No European government wanted to be the first to publicly structure its economy around reduced dependence on the United States. That felt like an act of hostility toward an ally. It felt like a declaration that the transatlantic relationship was no longer reliable. No one wanted to say that out loud, even if everyone was thinking it. Canada went first. And by going first, Canada absorbed the political cost that every other nation had been unwilling to bear. Now the path is cleared, not hostile, prudent, sovereign. The vocabulary Carney established, the framing of diversification as economic sovereignty rather than anti-American hostility, has given every other nation the language it needs to pursue the same strategy without triggering a confrontation. Japan's trade minister made a public statement referencing economic relationships built on mutual respect rather than asymmetric dependency. Australia's Treasury Secretary used the phrase structural resilience in a way that every trade analyst recognized as code for reducing American exposure. Each nation using different words, each nation arriving at the same destination, and here's the paradox that the White House discovered in the 72 hours that followed. The paradox that has made this moment not merely a setback, but structurally unanswerable. If the president enforces the threatened consequences, the enforcement damages the American economy at least as much as it damages Canada, especially with allied nations now actively supporting Canadian trade diversification. Every dollar of enforcement damage is matched or exceeded by damage to American industries, supply chains, and consumer prices. Enforcement does not punish Canada. It punishes both countries equally while proving to the world that the United States would rather absorb mutual destruction than accept that a smaller nation said no. If the president escalates beyond trade into diplomatic or security dimensions, the escalation against a NATO ally triggers the most severe allied crisis since the founding of the alliance. European governments that have so far maintained careful neutrality would be forced to respond. The institutional cost would take a generation to repair. If the president negotiates, the negotiation is itself an admission. The ultimatum said these terms are final. Returning to negotiate different terms proves that the consequences were not enforceable. Every future negotiating partner, every future trade confrontation, every future ultimatum will carry an asterisk. Remember Canada? They said no, and the consequences did not come. And if the president does nothing, the rejection stands. The coalition solidifies. The diversification accelerates. The infrastructure gets built. The president's action calcifies into permanent institutional memory across every foreign ministry, every trade office, and every economic planning bureau on Earth. Silence is the slowest path to the same destination. The permanent devaluation of American trade ultimatums as a tool of economic foreign policy. Every path leads to the same place. The mechanism is broken. The question is only how quickly the implications fully materialize. Donald Trump issued the most aggressive trade ultimatum any American president has ever delivered to an allied nation. 30-day deadline, 4 demands, each one designed to establish the precedent that American economic leverage is absolute and compliance is mandatory. Mark Carney rejected every term publicly, unambiguously, using a single word, irrevocable. That signaled the rejection was not a negotiating position, but a structural commitment that no future government could reverse. In 72 hours, 7 nations publicly endorsed the rejection. 4 nations paused their own compliance negotiations with the United States. 2 credit rating agencies affirmed Canada's sovereign rating. The Canadian dollar held. International investment banks recommended increased Canadian allocation. And the coalition that did not exist before the rejection now exists permanently. The mechanism that the United States has used to win trade confrontations for 80 years, the assumption that defiance costs more than compliance, was tested this week. It failed. The failure was public, measurable, and documented in enough detail that every nation on Earth can now replicate the strategy. Not because they are hostile to the United States, but because they watched Canada do the math and discovered that the math works. The president issued the ultimatum because he believed the size of the American economy made refusal unthinkable, that no nation 1/10 its size would absorb the risk, that the math was so overwhelming that compliance was the only rational choice. Instead, the ultimatum revealed something the math had been hiding, that American trade leverage had been quietly eroding for years, sustained not by structural advantage but by the assumption of structural advantage, an assumption that no one had tested because no one had been willing to bear the cost of testing it. Carney bore the cost, the assumption broke, and what was revealed underneath was not American weakness. It was something more dangerous to American interests than weakness. Overestimation, the belief that a tool still works long after the conditions that made it work have changed, the belief that a bluff never needs to be defended because no one will ever call it, the belief that dominance is permanent simply because dominance has always been permanent, the most expensive assumption in the history of American economic foreign policy and the one that just collapsed. The president tried to use the ultimatum to force Canada into submission. Instead, the ultimatum forced a question that the entire international system is now answering. What happens when the world's largest economy issues a final demand and a country 1/10 its size says no? What happens when the bluff is called and the bluffer has to decide between enforcement and retreat? What happens when every other nation watching realizes that the emperor's leverage has no clothes? The answer arrived in 72 hours, and the answer changed everything. Not because Canada is powerful, but because Canada proved that defiance is survivable. And once defiance is survivable, compliance is a choice. And once compliance is a choice, the leverage that depended on compliance being mandatory is gone, not diminished, not weakened, gone. 80 years of American trade dominance built on one assumption tested by one country that did the math, took the risk, and proved that the math had changed. The ultimatum was the test, the rejection was the answer, and the answer, as Mark Carney said from a podium in Ottawa with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, is irrevocable. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.